last 2 years.
This meeting is being recorded.
And I've served on both the organizing committee and now as the chair of the Species Working Group Subcommittee. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to what will hopefully be the first of several engagement sessions that we're going to be holding on the R2R process and species working groups. And before I turn it over to Paul, I just wanted to remind you guys of some general rules of Zoom. I know we're all experts at it at this point in time, but if I can just ask you all to keep yourself muted during the presentations. And this is an engagement session, so we want folks to be engaged. So please try to have your video on, and especially if you're speaking. We will have an opportunity to do a Q&A after the lightning talk. So I'll ask you to hold your questions for the individual speakers during those talks until the end of the 4 talks. And you can either feel free to unmute yourself during that open Q&A period prior to going into breakouts, or you can use the chat. And several of us will be monitoring the chat for salient questions that come in. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Paul Schmidt. Paul is the director of Road to Recovery, and in his current role with R2R, he's leading the continued development, evolution, and implementation of the Road to Recovery process for key species on the brink. Prior to joining Road to Recovery, Paul has a long history of being a bird conservation leader. He was the assistant director for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 7 years. And then after that, he was the chief conservation scientist for Ducks Unlimited. We were lucky enough to pull Paul back out of retirement and take advantage of his depth of knowledge and expertise in conservation delivery. So Paul, I will turn it over to you, and then I will introduce each of our speakers when they are ready to speak. Thanks everyone for being here.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Basically what he said is I've been around a long time, but I've enjoyed bird conservation for all those many years, and none more right now because of the excitement I think there is around Road to Recovery. And I add my thanks to all of you for joining on a Friday afternoon, particularly East Coast, where you're getting ready for the weekend. So thank you very much. It demonstrates the commitment and passion that so many of you have. So Road to Recovery is, my job is to give you a little introduction to what we're doing and kind of clarify some things that we've learned over time. Road to Recovery is an initiative that is focused on bringing enhanced biological and social science to the strategic recovery of species and populations. It's intended to build on the great work of so many people over so many years in bird conservation, and more importantly is to fill a niche and adding value to the fabric of bird conservation. As my friend Tom Will likes to say, bird conservation is like a braided river where many braids flow in the same direction, filling the many needs or elements of successful bird conservation. R2R is but one of those braids and intends to fill a niche on recovering species through the application of new technologies and strategies. For a more comprehensive look at the R2R process, I encourage you to look at the guidance document that we developed from the last workshop we did last year, where hundreds of bird conservationists, scientists, etc., joined us. Kia Williams, our graduate fellow, will put that in the chat if you haven't had a chance to look at it. But I know you can download it from our website, or of course, I think Kia put it in the registration or invitation that you all received as well. The Road to Recovery has identified 91 species of birds in North America that are priorities because of their steep declines or lack of information on their status. We call out these species because of the urgency to act. In the United States, our goal is to keep these species from having to be listed on the endangered species list, demonstrating a measure of success in our conservation efforts. We recognize that other countries, such as Canada, may look at that goal a bit differently because of their structure in their laws. But nonetheless, they see value of recovering species that are demonstrating steep declines. The point is, we must act with a sense of urgency. We also recognize that there are many examples of great recovery efforts that have occurred over the years. And we honored some of those efforts in workshops that we've already conducted. We want to enhance and grow the community of species working groups, or perhaps species recovery teams. We hold up examples of success and provide a roadmap built on those successes in hopes of inspiring more and better work going forward. Today's engagement session focuses on the work of 4 teams using the R2R guidance to more fully develop the science to recover those species. These are among the 91 that we feel require urgent action. But we are not suggesting that these 4 species are the highest priorities. We are simply saying they are pilots in our effort to demonstrate success through the R2R process. I want to thank the Knobloch Family Foundation for supporting the efforts of these 4 teams and the overall effort of Road to Recovery. Today, we'll hear about each of these efforts to improve upon the science and the team's goals to recover those species and the challenges that they face. The R2R effort intends to complement or enhance the great work being done by joint ventures, species working groups, and so many other organizations. There is much work to be done, and together we can be successful in recovering these wonderful natural resources. Thanks a lot, Brant. Back to you.
Thanks, Paul. So we'll start up with our first speaker, who is Katie Christie. She is a wildlife biologist who works for the Threatened, Endangered, and Diversity Program with Alaska's Department of Natural Resources. Oh, sorry, Katie, I lost my bio of you.
That's all right. Fish and game.
All right, well, we'll just go ahead right into Katie's talk. So she's going to talk to us about lesser yellowlegs and their path to recovery.
Thanks, Brant. Can everyone hear me and see my screen? Okay, I'm seeing not. So my name is Katie Christie. I work for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Threatened, Endangered, and Diversity Program. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Lesser Yellowlegs Project. But first, I'm going to acknowledge my co-authors, Brad Anders, Jim Johnson, and Kelly Strigley-Werner, all of whom are working towards achieving our objectives. I'd also like to acknowledge our funding sources, without whom this project would not be possible. So thank you. So the lesser yellowlegs is a high urgency species. That is, it is considered to be highly vulnerable to extinction due to steep population declines over the past few decades. So multiple lines of evidence have pointed to these declines. Between 63 and 70% decline has been detected over the past 40 years across the species range. And then in Alaska, over just a 12-year period, recent surveys indicate a 45 to 65% decline. So where are we in the road to recovery process? Well, you may be familiar with this diagram from the R2R guidance document. We are in phase 1. So we are in the process of assessing and learning about the biological science of the species and the social science as well. So we're in the process of incorporating both the human dimensions and the biology of this species. So this species breeds across the boreal forest of North America, all the way from Alaska to eastern Canada. They occur in boreal wetlands, and they migrate to Central and South America. So this species has a huge range covering almost the entire Western Hemisphere. So there are many threats that could be affecting this species. Unsustainable harvest in northern South America and the Caribbean region is thought to be a threat. And I'll talk a little more about this in the next slide. Agricultural practices. This species occurs in wetlands that are surrounded by agricultural areas, particularly during migration and the non-breeding period. Climate change is likely to affect this wetland-dependent species, both in the breeding range and the non-breeding range and migration. Coastal development is likely to affect lesser yellowlegs as well. They occur in coastal mudflats throughout their life cycle. And then habitat loss for a number of reasons, whether it's agricultural development or rural and urban development, as well as climate change may be affecting the species. So I mentioned the issue of harvest. This is the most obvious and potentially imminent threat to the species. Lesser yellowlegs are the most widely hunted shorebird in the Atlantic flyway. And here's a map where the harvest primarily occurs. So between 48 and 102,000 individual birds are harvested each year in this region. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty around these numbers. Nevertheless, these numbers are considered to be unsustainable given the population size of lesser yellowlegs. So we recently completed a tracking study where we put satellite transmitters on birds at various breeding locations from Alaska to Quebec. And so we were interested in tracking them over the course of a year to understand various things about their ecology. So we were interested in understanding linked populations and migratory connectivity, as well as differential exposure to threats of the different breeding populations throughout their annual cycle. And we wanted to identify key habitats and stopover areas during migration. So what did we find? Well, this is a graphical abstract that was produced by Jamie Capleton based on analysis by Laura McDuffie, who analyzed these migration data for her master's thesis. And so what Laura found was that if you're a bird breeding in Alaska, you have a very low likelihood of migrating through this area where harvest occurs. In contrast, if you are breeding in Eastern Canada, say James Bay or Mingan, or you're migrating through this area from northern breeding grounds, you have a much higher likelihood of occurring in this area during the harvest season. You can see that the thickness of these arrows is wider, and that indicates a higher probability of occurrence in this area during hunting season. And then the central Canadian breeding birds have a moderate probability of occurring in this area. What else did we learn? Well, I've circled this region here in light green. This is a prairie poplars region. Lesser yellowlegs that bred west of Churchill, Manitoba, and including the Churchill birds, stopped over in this area to refuel on both their fall and spring migrations. So this area has been identified as an important stopover region for a large segment of the population. And they occur in areas that are often surrounded by agricultural fields. So potholes and wetlands that are surrounded by cropland. I also want to point out the importance of the Pampas region of Argentina. So many, not all, but many of our birds spent the non-breeding period in the Pampas of Argentina. And this is another area that is affected by agriculture. So moving forward, what are our objectives? Well, objective 1 is to conduct demographic studies in Anchorage, Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska, and Churchill, Manitoba, to identify and understand the drivers of survival and reproductive success in these areas. Ultimately, we would like to create an integrated population model. Objective 2 is to investigate the effects of pesticides and other agricultural practices on lesser yellowlegs, as well as other shorebirds that use wetlands in the prairie poplars region. We also want to partner with farmers, landowners, and tribes on wetland conservation in this area. Objective 3 is to reassess sustainable harvest limits. Why do we need to reassess it? Well, we now know that the threat of harvest does not impact all breeding populations equally. It's particularly a threat for the central and eastern breeding populations. And so we need to figure out how many lesser yellowlegs can be harvested sustainably in this area. We also need to understand the human dimensions of the harvest. So people harvest yellowlegs for sport and subsistence, and we need to understand the economic and cultural drivers of the harvest. We also need to identify solutions that are beneficial to individuals, communities, and the shorebirds themselves. Objective 4, our last objective, is to coordinate with partners and develop a recovery plan. And we are looking forward to meeting for a full day workshop at the upcoming Western Hemisphere Shorebird Group meeting in September, where we will integrate the biological science and social science on this species and hopefully come up with some solutions and move forward with a recovery. With that, I would like to thank you all for attending. I'll hand it over to Brett.
Thanks so much, Katie. Just as a reminder, we'll hold questions until the end. And if you have questions specific to Katie's work, we can go ahead and put those in the chat. So David Yini is our next speaker. He's an avian ecologist for the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. David has 17 years of experience in avian ecology and conservation, and his current work includes avian ecology and monitoring, habitat-wildlife relationship studies, and working specifically on rare and endangered species. So he's going to talk to us about his work with evening grosbeaks. David, you want to take it over?
Yeah, it's telling me I'm not able to share my screen. Host disabled participant sharing.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, so we're good now? Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Brant. I am glad to be part of this session today to share some information with you about our pilot species project on evening grosbeak, and I'm really excited to learn from all of you during the breakout portion of today's session as well. Before I begin, I want to recognize the other core members of our project team: Matthew Young from the Finch Research Network and Luke DeGroat from Powder Mill Avian Research Center. As I know others will agree, these projects are only possible through collaborations, and this project itself is actually an outgrowth of collaborative research we began with evening grosbeaks in Pennsylvania 6 years ago. I also want to acknowledge and thank all the organizations that have provided funding and support to this project thus far. All of our work to date and this current opportunity to conserve the evening grosbeak through the Road to Recovery initiative would not be possible without your support. So thank you. So how does evening grosbeak fit into the Road to Recovery process? In 2016, Partners in Flight highlighted a 92% range-wide population decline since 1970. And they noted this as the steepest decline among land birds in the United States and Canada. It was added to the Partners in Flight Yellow Watch list and concurrently listed as a special concern species in Canada. Then in 2018, the IUCN updated the evening grosbeak red list status to vulnerable. Based on the trends cited in these other listings, Road to Recovery listed evening grosbeak among its 90+ species on the brink of endangerment in 2020. Evening grosbeak is in the high urgency group for those species with large population loss and continued or accelerated decline. So when you look at the R2R 4-stage process, our project is in phase 1. And this is where we're assessing and learning both through the species biology and through social science. So currently we are assessing what we know about the possible threats driving this huge decline in evening grosbeaks. For one, we do know there's a link between evening grosbeak populations and spruce budworm population cycles. We also know that habitat changes and mature forest loss may be a factor. Evening grosbeaks suffer from collisions, mortalities from collisions with both windows and vehicles. Disease may be a factor, and then also the unknown effects of climate change on its spruce fir forest breeding habitats. We're also in the beginning stages of identifying partners in evening grosbeak conservation. We're evaluating who diverse partners are, from local groups to national agencies, and their locations throughout the evening grosbeak continental range. We have the task of beginning to address evening grosbeak knowledge gaps, both in species biology and social science. And what this means is that we're identifying what biological information is needed to develop the conservation plans that will help put evening grosbeak on the road to recovery. This includes things like linking populations, determining migratory connectivity, and hopefully pinpointing which of these threats and limiting factors are most pressing. At the same time, we're looking to include partner needs and objectives into as many aspects of the process as we can. For our project in the current timeline through 2023, we have specific objectives that match up with phase 1 of the R2R process. Evening grosbeak has 5 subpopulations or call types that breed across Canada, the northern and western United States, and Mexico. Most call type populations have an eruptive migration strategy, where they leave breeding areas in large numbers in search of more abundant winter food sources. In Pennsylvania, we've been studying evening grosbeak winter and migration movements since 2017 through color banding and resighting, and radio tagging and tracking via the Modus Wildlife Tracking System. Now, as an R2R pilot project, we aim to deploy new low-tech sunbird satellite tags across 3 major regions of the species' US winter range over the next 2 years, with our first deployments beginning this past winter in Maine and Minnesota. We plan to bring together new data collected across the range with data from our Pennsylvania birds to begin linking populations and evaluating migratory connectivity. We have the future goal of reaching multiple call type populations and other major regional populations, including the Western United States, Canada, and possibly Mexico. Our tagging efforts across the evening grosbeak range will allow us to map local and landscape scale use of habitats. Here you can see some maps of our early satellite tracking data from birds tagged this winter in Minnesota and Maine. Here you see some landscape movements as birds move from wintering areas in Minnesota to breeding areas in Canada. And then in the inset map, local movements on breeding grounds in Quebec from a bird that was tagged in Maine. Using these data, we aim to link populations across the grosbeak's annual cycle. Finally, as an important component of phase 1, we are establishing an international evening grosbeak working group. Even though it's in its infancy, we've already engaged more than 40 partners through our first several meetings, but we still will be seeking to strategically add partners from across the evening grosbeak's expansive range and from diverse backgrounds, including local communities, natural resource industries, citizen scientists, native peoples, and then, of course, other conservation groups. To wrap up, I'll leave you with some thoughts on how we envision the road to recovery process helping advance evening grosbeak conservation. The process directs us toward the intentional inclusion of diverse partners from the beginning, rather than somewhere down the road. This sets the stage for holistic conservation, meeting the needs of multiple interest groups while working toward recovery of the species. Through this process, we look to engage with partners toward conservation actions at key science-based locations. For example, in this map, you see spruce budworm outbreak zones where we were able to link populations, evening grosbeaks from our Pennsylvania wintering populations, or places where grosbeaks may be an important part of the local economy, like Sax-Zim Bog. Now, one hypothetical example of this would be to involve forestry agencies and communities early on in the process. This would include discussions about the science-based needs for evening grosbeaks, such as their relationship with spruce budworms and the forest habitat they need, as well as the forestry and local community needs. Ideally, the outcome would be a co-production of strategies for management of forests and spruce budworm that will also benefit evening grosbeak in key locations throughout its range. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. Our next speaker is Callie Stanley. Callie is a postdoc at Georgetown University, and she is working on the migration ecology of yellow-billed cuckoos. Callie received her master's from York University and her PhD from the University of Maryland, where she worked on patterns of migratory connectivity and the non-breeding ecology of wood thrush. Callie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to share the 2 Road to Recovery projects that I'm currently working on, or that we're working on. So the yellow-billed cuckoo is a declining long-distance migratory land bird. They breed in large areas of North America, which is shown here in red on this eBird relative abundance map. Both eBird data and satellite transmitters suggest that the Gran Chaco is the main wintering area for yellow-billed cuckoos across the range. And satellite tracking has also revealed key staging areas for individuals across the range in northern South America, as well as in Mexico for Western populations. Across the range, yellow-billed cuckoos have been declining, but the decline has been particularly severe in the West, where the bird has been extirpated from the majority of its historic range, which is shown here in light green. In 2014, the Western distinct population segment was listed as federally threatened. And now in the US, it's mainly restricted to these areas in blue. And then it is also restricted to found in northern Mexico during the breeding season. Within the Road to Recovery framework, yellow-billed cuckoos are solidly in phase 1 in both the biological science and social science knowledge. However, with regards to the state of the knowledge of the species biology, we are much further ahead in our assessment of what we know compared with what we know about the social science. Thinking about the biological knowledge and the state of that knowledge, we do have really good information about migratory connectivity and linked population from tracking data from both Eastern and Western populations. In terms of our knowledge about the ecology of cuckoos on the breeding grounds, the Western designated population segment has definitely been better studied compared to the East. And this is largely because it is a listed species. The Western DPS is largely restricted to riparian habitat, and there's very good information about critical breeding habitat for Western populations, as well as their major threats, which include loss of riparian habitat or degradation of riparian habitat due to changes in hydrological processes or even just maturation of riparian zones. However, demographic data is much more sparse in the West and is really confined to only a handful of studies. By contrast, Eastern populations have been studied far less. However, they are picked up by a number of large-scale monitoring projects, so we do have demographic data available for much of the Eastern range. On the non-breeding ground, far less is known about cuckoos, although they have been studied at a key staging area in Colombia. On their wintering region in the Gran Chaco, habitat loss is thought to be a major threat. But in general, information about the non-breeding season is a major black box for cuckoos. In the West, there is an active working group that has been around since 2008, the Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo Working Group. However, we don't currently have a formal working group for the East. With regards to what we know about the social science knowledge for cuckoos, on the breeding ground, the Western DPS is much more advanced compared to the Eastern populations. And in particular, this is because the US Fish and Wildlife Service is in the process of a species status assessment right now, which will be used to eventually develop a recovery plan. And so partners and affected parties are currently being identified. And this work has not happened in the East yet. On the non-breeding grounds, we have identified partners in the Gran Chaco, both academic partners and NGOs, to begin working in that region. And so identifying additional partners and determining affected parties is just in the initial phases. To fill in the knowledge gaps needed to advance cuckoo recovery, we currently have 2 major Road to Recovery projects. The first focused on developing a range-wide population model, and we've been working on this for a couple of years now. And then the second, which we are just starting this fall, we'll be working on the non-breeding grounds of cuckoos in the Gran Chaco. For the first project, we have already established linked populations by developing a migratory connectivity map. And we've done this by deploying satellite tags across 8 breeding populations throughout the range. And for all breeding populations, we've seen that the Gran Chaco ecoregion in South America is really the predominant wintering range for all birds, all cuckoos. And this has really been helpful in narrowing down the wintering range for cuckoos, which in this map, you can see as almost a much larger portion of South America. The second objective we are currently working on is using mortality data from the satellite tags to estimate regional variation in seasonal survival. And for the final objective, we will combine information on migratory connectivity with data from existing range-wide monitoring programs such as MAPS and Breeding Bird Survey to develop a range-wide population model. The satellite data has been really crucial in identifying the Gran Chaco, which is just zoomed in here as the major wintering area. And so for our second Road to Recovery project, we are really focused on filling in the gaps in our knowledge about the non-breeding ecology of cuckoos in that ecoregion, and really just understanding basic information about their ecology down there. And equally important, our second objective of this project is focused on working with BirdLife International and their local affiliates, Gira Paraguay and Aves Argentinas, to begin developing the social science knowledge needed for the advancements of the recovery process. And here are a couple of our partners in that project. So how have we used the Road to Recovery framework in these projects? Both projects were really designed following the Road to Recovery model, and in particular, the first project, which was more focused on advancing the biological science, we really used that original Road to Recovery pyramid to structure the project. However, so far, the largest impact of the Road to Recovery framework has really been the push to include an understanding of the human dimensions of the recovery process, and using the Road to Recovery model to guide us on how best to integrate both the biological and social sciences towards advancing recovery of the species. And just to wrap up, I wanted to mention all of our wonderful partners on the two projects, Road to Recovery projects we have, both in the US and in Paraguay and Argentina, and then of the wonderful funding sources for these two projects. And that is it for me.
Thanks so much, Callie. All right, so our last speaker is going to be Emily Filiberti, and she is a graduate student in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology at the University of Maine. Emily is working with Amber Roth, and her thesis focuses on estimating adult annual survival for golden wing warblers throughout their breeding range. So Emily has kindly agreed to fill in for Amber today. So thanks for joining us, Emily. Take it away.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Can you guys hear me? Okay, so thank you guys for the opportunity to join you today. As mentioned, I'll be presenting on behalf of Amber Roth, and I'll be talking about, among other things, our efforts to improve estimation of golden wing warbler survival. So golden wings were assessed as being in high urgency of conservation attention and recovery. As you can see, their population has declined by about 60% since the start of the Breeding Bird Survey. And their population is largely separated into two regional populations, one in the Appalachians and one in the Great Lakes, with only approximately 3 to 4% of the population occurring in the Appalachian region. So they're currently listed as threatened on the IUCN Red List, also on the PIF Red Watch List. They are threatened in Canada and a species of greatest conservation need in 27 of the state wildlife action plans. And they're also under review for ESA protection in the US. Potential contributing factors to their decline, not an inclusive list, habitat loss in both the breeding and wintering grounds, hybridization with blue-winged warblers, and also just general poor overwinter survival. So thanks to the many efforts of the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group members, golden wing recovery activities have been undertaken in all 4 phases at this point, with members conducting pretty extensive research throughout the full annual cycle. For example, golden wings have a monitoring program throughout the Appalachians, as well as site scale evaluation protocols to really assess implemented management actions. Additionally, a full annual cycle plan was completed in 2012 and partially revised in 2019 to incorporate new knowledge about the species and response to management. So because of this, we've undertaken more of a circular adaptive management process, meaning we continuously work in all 4 phases. However, I will mention that the social science aspect of golden wing recovery is one area where we really need to increase our focus to improve the conservation effectiveness of our activities. So on the R2R pyramid, our current project falls right in the middle as we try to identify limiting factors using vital rates and full annual cycle models. Given the severe global decline, it is critical that we understand the regional populations and how they are different demographically. And to do that, we need to dig into the underlying mechanisms of population growth rates. So there are several different mechanisms that drive population growth rates. Different demographic parameters all contribute to population growth or decline, with some contributing more than others. And understanding the relative importance of these different parameters across different regions is important in our understanding of why a population is either increasing or declining. And for a migratory species such as the golden wing, we have to consider outside the breeding grounds. So what's happening during migration and also on the wintering grounds? What does survival look like during these time periods? And understanding this can really help with current and future conservation strategies. So one approach to understanding the complexity of populations is through the use of integrated population models, or IPMs. And these are models that jointly analyze data on both population size and demographic data. So the structure of an IPM looks something like this diagram with 3 distinct categories of data: productivity, population count, and capture recapture. And from the capture recapture data, we can derive estimates of age and or sex-specific survival, as well as breeding versus wintering versus migratory specific survival. And this really allows us to understand which components of survival have the biggest influence on population growth. So our current project, which is funded by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, aims to construct a full annual cycle IPM for golden wings. And this is a pretty large collaborative effort, currently being led by Amber Roth's postdoc at UMaine, Jessica Hightower. And it includes data collected by many different collaborators. And within this IPM, the survival component is the focus of the R2R funded project. So survival estimates can be derived from band recapture data or through telemetry. However, information can be quite limited for female golden wings, as they're pretty elusive and more difficult to capture than males. And they're also rarely re-encountered in subsequent years. So part of our project is deploying low-tech nanotags on both male and female golden wings across their breeding range in an effort to estimate sex-specific survival. So these tagged individuals can be detected by both the Motus Wildlife Tracking System stations and with our handheld ground receivers. And as you can see on this map, the Motus network is rapidly gaining in popularity with a recent explosion of stations throughout North America. And we were actually able to contribute to this network last spring in 2021 by constructing 2 stations near our study sites in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. So for our birds, we affix the low-tech nanotags to the back of both male and females using the leg loop harness method. And these tags are estimated to last approximately 400 days, which is long enough to detect returning tagged individuals in subsequent years. So last year, we were able to deploy 82 nanotags in 3 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. And we also installed 2 Motus stations in each study area, so 6 total Motus stations. As you can see, we didn't have as high of female representation in the Appalachians as we would have liked, but range-wide, we were able to deploy 31 nanotags on females and 51 nanotags on males. Some preliminary results from our field season this year. You can see our return rates this spring, which include both color-banded control males, so males without any tags, and tagged males and females. And again, we needed the control males just to assess possible negative tag effects. So you can see that tagged adult males had pretty similar return rates as our control males, which could suggest there wasn't an adverse tag effect. However, our tagged females returned at much lower rates, with none detected or recited in the Appalachian states, and only a couple detected in Wisconsin. So it is possible that the tags affect females differently than males. And I will mention, in an attempt to minimize tag effects, we did end up shortening the antenna length this season to the shortest possible length without losing substantial detection distance. So the R2R project objective, which was to expand nanotag deployment to improve apparent survival estimates at range-wide and regional scales. We were actually able to, with these resources, expand the study this year to include 6 additional states and 9 additional study sites. So with the addition of these collaborators, we were able to boost our 2022 Appalachian female sample size to 30 and our Great Lakes to 44. So we're pretty pleased with the number of females we were able to tag, given the difficulty in finding and capturing them, particularly in the Appalachians. And we look forward to returning all of us collaborators next year to find returning birds in 2023. So with that, I'll just mention funding for this project primarily comes from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as a number of other funding sources. And I will shout out the Knobloch Family Foundation for being a primary funder. And I'd like to thank all of our NanoTag collaborators, as well as our project team members for making this expanded project possible.
Thanks so much, Emily. So we'll just take a couple minutes and allow folks to ask questions. And so I'll just open that up. You can again put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask any of the presenters questions. Don't be shy.
I have a question for
Thanks.
Callie. Callie, I'm curious about how you connected with local partners in the Grand Chaco region. Did you connect with BirdLife International first, and then they connected you with local partners, or did you reach out directly to conservation organizations working in South America?
We actually did not go to BirdLife International first. When we, it was a bunch of things that led us there. Just by presenting our preliminary data and reaching out to people that we knew had not necessarily worked in the Gran Chaco, but worked in that region of South America, we were quickly, given a short list of people who would be good to reach out to. And Gira Paraguay, which is the Paraguay BirdLife International local affiliate, came up very quickly as one of the key groups working in the area. And so that's kind of how we initiated that work with BirdLife International and the Aves Argentinas as well. But yeah, it was just, getting out the research so people saw where our birds were going to, but also just cold emailing people to get their opinions about who would be the best people to work with, and then seeing who was actually interested in starting a project on migratory birds in the area. And I do think we weren't able to do this because this happened during COVID, but I do think going to local meetings in those regions would have also been really helpful, and actually meeting people in person. But although we wanted to, it wasn't something we could do.
Great, thank you.
I just saw a question from Rosalind Renfrew that kind of comes on to that. And we don't have any current plans to work in Bolivia, but it is something we want to do in the future. It was kind of suggested that maybe we start in Paraguay and Argentina first and get something started there, and then expand up to Bolivia. But definitely Armonia is one of the groups that we were thinking of, but I will definitely take down the other name as well. Thank you very much.
I had a question for Katie about lesser yellowlegs, and forgive me if you said this, but it looked like the eastern populations are more impacted by the hunting, and so I was wondering if you had if there was what you mentioned about the differential declines in maybe the two different areas from Western and Eastern North America, the breeders, and what you think might be influencing the declines for those Western breeding populations if they're not being hunted?
Yes, a very good question. It does beg the question of, well, if hunting isn't impacting the Alaska populations, which are declining, what threats are affecting them. And so that led us to cast our net a little wider than just simply the harvest issue, because it's obviously that's not the cause of declines in Alaska. And it would be interesting to look at the same time period and compare different segments of the populations in terms of how steep those declines are. We haven't done that yet, but it would be something that it would be a good thing for us to look into. The threats that are affecting the Alaska breeding birds, well, I mean, there are several possibilities. Their dependence on agricultural areas really emerged as a result of the migration tracking study. And so that caused us to look into what's going on in the prairie potholes region, where they all spend days to weeks during both spring and fall migration. So are they encountering pesticides there? Are there other agricultural practices that are impacting habitat availability or prey densities in that area? And then what are some factors in the non-breeding grounds in South America? So the pampas of Argentina is another area that we're focusing in on and looking at what might be affecting their habitat there.
Katie, we've got a quick follow-up question from the chat. Becky Stewart's asking, how is the working group and your work linked to various flyway shorebird initiatives and plans? And are there overlaps and synergies that we can capitalize on? And after this question, we'll go into breakouts, and I'll just give you guys a brief primer on what we're going to be doing in the breakout rooms.
Yes, thank you for that question. We were just talking about this yesterday. We are scrutinizing the Atlantic shorebird plan as well as the mid-continent shorebird plan, and looking at the threats that have already been identified in those plans. And we're going to be highlighting threats that we think are particularly pertinent for lesser yellowlegs. And so at our working group meeting coming up in September, we're going to be looking at those different threats, identifying the most important threats for this species, and then coming up with solutions, hopefully, ways in which we can address these threats and reverse the declines.
Thanks. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go into some breakout rooms. You know, a huge part of the Road to Recovery process involves this notion of co-production, where we engage partners early and often to design research studies and account for objectives of our partners. That's decision makers and affected parties. And so what we've done is we put forward a couple of questions, which I put in the chat. I might be a little bit further back up. And the goal of the breakout rooms is for us to talk about and learn from each other in terms of what's been successful, what hasn't been successful in specific working groups, potential challenges when partners have diverse objectives. How do we reconcile some of those things? And so the goal is for all of us to engage in these breakout rooms. And so I think we're going to do about 25 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a bit of a group conversation, try to pull out some key highlights from the breakout rooms. So with that, I will have Katie push us into breakout rooms. Seems like most folks are coming back. I don't want to call on anyone specific, but I'd love to hear from any of the focal species folks that, you know, any kind of key things, takeaways, that discussion points that they felt like were really valuable or insightful in their breakout rooms. Or other facilitators for that matter.
I'll jump in then, if you'll allow me, Brent.
Yes, please. Thank you, Ashley.
Okay. So in the group that I was part of, there was a lot of discussion about how the species working groups are going to be more effective if they are working with existing other alliances, networks, et cetera. So we talked about joint ventures, we talked about partners in flight, we talked about regional alliances in Latin America. We also talked about thinking beyond birds, and there may be other types of biodiversity initiatives, habitat related initiatives in the area where you're working. And being part of that can help you be tuned in more to what land managers are needing It can also make sure that you are trusted and plugged into the communities where you're working. It can also make sure that you're aligning your work with other things beyond the individual species. So we talked a great deal about that.
Thanks, super helpful. Anyone else?
Our group discussed how the need for enthusiastic leadership of the working groups, where when you have a leader that's really enthusiastic and can devote the time that is necessary to the working groups, they are much more effective. And we discussed possibly providing some sort of funding source to buy out people's time, to provide them with dedicated, I guess, to give them the ability to spend the time that is necessary for the working groups, and so they don't get burned out or get told by whoever they're working for that isn't really how they should be spending their time. So we thought that if there's some way we can kind of find funding to support those leaders of those groups to keep them running smoothly and sustainable, it'd be great.
100% agree with that. I know it's something that Road to Recovery has talked about a decent amount. Yeah, I mean, everyone has a regular job oftentimes, and so contributions to working groups are easy to fall by the wayside. Paul.
Yeah, that was a great comment there. Thanks. We do, Road to Recovery does want to support the species working group, and capacity is clearly one of those. In our group, we did talk a good bit about joint ventures, so I'll give that another shout out as a safe area to work and to build partnerships and engage folks who are affected by either the research or the conservation treatment. Talked a little bit about, there's always a game changer, and one example was bringing a big industrial landowner to the table and helping kind of spur on the research, and then ultimately will be the conservation. But it helped to have the joint venture there to sort of bring them in. Also talking about breaking down silos and barriers. Some, spoke about barriers between like states, for instance, and doing things differently, but also even silos within a particular agency. In this case, it was a federal agency that has a lot of effect on conservation, but yet they had their district offices weren't always in sync, and so breaking down those barriers to get some synergy was a key to our discussion. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Paul. Tom.
Yeah, we have some really good examples of finding collaborations with unexpected partners and then using those opportunities to find common ground for objectives. But one question that came up at the very end of our conversation before we got brought back into the big group was, well, we could use some help with the human dimensions aspect of this work. We could use some assistance, and how do we get that help? And so I thought that would be a good time for us to call out Katie and hear about her availability.
Katie, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I would love to. Great opportunity for me to introduce myself to all of you. I'm Katie Holland, social science coordinator with Road to Recovery. I'm a research scientist at Virginia Tech, but my work is supporting social science in the bird conservation community through Road to Recovery efforts and through some work with NABC as well. I am a month into my position and have started to reach out to species working groups and help to provide social science brainstorming opportunities. I would love to hear from you. I'm in the process of figuring out a format to best support a wide array of species working groups. And I've brainstormed options like offering workshops and trainings, offering drop-in discussion sessions where we could focus on different human dimensions topics as voluntary groups of representatives from different working groups. So you'll hear from me, but I'm here and I would love to connect with each of you. So please never hesitate to reach out. I'll drop my email in the chat. And while I can't do all of your human dimensions research integration, I can certainly brainstorm ideas and help to point you in the right direction and find resources to make that work happen.
Thanks so much, Katie. I can just say, having worked directly with Katie, she's amazing, and we're super excited to have her on board. EJ.
Well, agreed, Katie. It's great to have you on board, and we look forward to taking advantage of your significant skill set. Our group, we had some similar, I think, ideas that came from some of the other groups, but a couple of things I wanted to highlight was we talked about the importance of involving communities, and particularly early on that, you know, sometimes we don't account for. So let's say we do good science, it's actionable, it gets used. What's the impact on communities? And we want to start to really think about that up front before we actually get to that point of, you know, implementing work. Another thing was just, you know, that identifying whether you're talking about decision makers or partners or communities in Latin America in the wintering grounds is just tougher. And so just real important to pay attention to that, try and create good communication mechanisms, and then make it sustainable. You know, that too often we're able to interact with people for just 2 or 3 years and then, you know, we're out of there. So making that part sustainable. And then I guess the last thing I'd mention is just this idea, we talked some about what is actionable science, what are those products, and talked about some of those, but then how they vary depending on who the people are that are going to use those actionable items to actually put them into action, and tailoring those depending on the needs of the people that are able to take advantage of good science that's actionable. So good discussions. We didn't necessarily get to all our questions, but we had a really good discussion.
Thanks so much, EJ. You bring up a really important point that we spent some time talking about as well. And to have these sustained partnerships, oftentimes we have to meet the partners with where they're at, and not necessarily come at them immediately with the bird objective, but understand what their objective is and figure out how we can fit the bird piece into that, and that we may have to do some balancing in order to do that. Katie.
Thanks. Yeah, I echo those thoughts and appreciate Katie's involvement. She was in my group, so I got some nuggets of wisdom from her. One was that we need to ask landowners for permission to crop birds on their land, and if we're knocking on the doors anyway, we might as well collect some data on their views and their values. So that was a great piece of wisdom, and hopefully she'll help us design some surveys. And also another participant brought up the importance of really incorporating what end users might see as realistic in terms of management practices when you're designing studies. And she mentioned that when they designed a study of grassland interventions and management of grassland habitats, their treatments may not have been as extreme as would be, you know, scientifically perfect to look at changes, but they had realistic treatments. And so that's something that we can all think about in terms of coming up with management solutions. What is realistic? What might actually be taken on by these end users? And for the lesser yellows example, that would be, you know, realistic pesticide applications, for example, realistic treatments or, you know, flooding regimes of their crops. Thanks. That was a great.
Thanks, Katie. I mean, I think it's a great point. We can come up with amazing conservation delivery plans, but if they're not realistic for the partners in terms of how they get implemented on the ground, then they're never going to go anywhere. They're just going to sit on a shelf. So we need to understand the factors that go into how we do management on the ground and what's realistic and not realistic for those key partners. Mary.
I was thinking about the social science aspect and trainings, and I was thinking, have people thought much about trying to reach out to Latin America, bringing trainings to Latin America, as well as maybe apprenticeships or something like that?
That's great. I wonder if anybody, are you done, Mary? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh yeah, I'm done.
Okay. I'm wondering if working group folks who have experience engaging Latin American partners can speak to that specifically, and what sorts of approaches have been successful in creating those sustained engaged partnerships with international folks.
I'll go. So it was mentioned, I think earlier, it's consistency in being there. So you might have, obviously, grad students might just have a smaller, shorter window, but then their colleagues or they're partnered with people that are going to be there for the long time. So having a bit of a longer term vision so that you can build that trust and develop that longer standing relationship, because obviously perhaps us in the more northern part of the Americas have more flexibility to move around. A lot of people don't, and so it's really important to have that consistency. And if a student can't, that's totally understandable, but then they're partnered up with people that do have that longer term vision.
Thanks, Wendy. Edwin.
And I would just like to build on what Wendy just said. I think part of that consistency also allows you to really understand the local needs of those partners, so that it's really an equitable partnership, that you're working towards the recovery of a species that may be more of interest to a U.S. state or a U.S. partner, but they at the same time the needs of the partners on the ground or what their priorities are incorporated into proposals or planning processes, so that it's a true collaboration.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's super important. So we are closing out Ashley, go ahead.
I'll just say really quickly, I think policy change that promotes that is really useful as well. We talked about how the American Ornithological Society's Journal Ornithological Applications is going to be rolling out a policy that if you are trying to publish work that happens outside of your own country, that you need to have co-authors on that paper who are from the country where you're doing the work, to make sure that you are actually engaging people who work on the ground and not doing parachute science.
Yeah, 100% agree. I mean, authentic inclusivity is going to be super, super important in these sustained partnerships. Paul, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, you're going to come in after me again, but
no, I'm not.
Oh, you're not? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I just want to put in a plug. We hope within a couple of months that we will have a graduate fellow really focusing on the international aspects of, in particular, Latin American Caribbean. So stay tuned to that in the Road to Recovery, because we think maybe that's another, I'll say asset that this effort will have, and that you as a species working group may be able to tap into, but more to come on that. If I have to close it out, I'm going to say we really want you to fill out, and Katie Holland just put it in the chat, a little short survey that will help us in building, not only understanding how we did today in terms of this engagement session, but building them out into the future. So please take a couple of minutes to fill out that survey so that we can make these going forward even better. We hope you got something out of it. I want to thank Brant in particular, who's worried about making sure this comes off right, and he did a fantastic job, but also our four presenters, the lightning talks on the species that we're piloting. Just a fantastic afternoon. I hope you thought it was worthwhile, but if you didn't, please give us some constructive criticism on how we can build more in the future. And as Brant said at the very beginning, that we really want to do a series of these, so that because this is such a rich area of growth for all of us, that we want to grow together. We're going to do that in the coming months. So stay tuned. We have your emails. You'll be invited to more of these in the future, and hope you will attend. So my hat's off to all of you for particularly the East Coast people, which I'm one of. We're into the happy hour. Go enjoy the evening, and thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.